My name is Julianne, and I'll be your host for this webinar. First, we'd like to extend our warmest congratulations to you all for qualifying for the 2025 semifinal exam. And whether you're taking this exam this year or in an upcoming year, we hope you're excited to continue your USABO journey. The 2025 USABO semifinal exam is coming up in just 2 weeks on March 27th. And we know that you might be feeling a little nervous, excited, or maybe even a little overwhelmed right now. So today we are so fortunate to have several past USABO finalists with us who will share their expertise on how to prepare for the semifinal exam, their test-taking strategies, and walk through their thought processes with past problems. We hope that this will be a valuable resource for you, especially in the final stretch before the exam. So briefly, the webinar will begin with an overview of exam logistics and an introduction to the new changes to the semifinal exam this year. Then we'll move on into resources to prepare for the exam, followed by an in-depth walkthrough of each of the exam sections. We'll conclude with a live Q&A section, but throughout the webinar, please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box on the Zoom. Our panelists will be more than happy to answer your questions. And now I have the honor of introducing Mrs. Frame. Mrs. Frame presently serves as the Director, Advisor, and Consultant for the USA Bio-Olympiad and Special Projects for the Center for Excellence in Education. Her passion for biology was modeled by her father's example of caring and protecting our environment. Her career has allowed her to share this passion with people in all walks of life all over the world. Currently, her passions are watercolor painting, dog agility with her 5.2-pound Papillon Gracie, and gardening. We are so fortunate to have her here with us today, and she truly is the backbone of the USABO. This competition wouldn't be possible without her and her expertise.
Thank you, Julianne. That was a wonderful introduction. And to Julianne, who's done all the work putting this together, thank you so much for everything, and the other panelists that we have. So I'll go down through the slides that we have. First of all, I'm going to echo that wonderful congratulations to all of you. That's significant. All right. And we're all very proud of you. We're all looking forward to working with you over the next coming weeks. All right. And this is a grand start for all of you. And updates, this is the overview of what I'll speak to. The structure of the exam, where finals is going to be located, finals selection, registration. And then I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on the integrity of the USABO in the exams, because it's becoming even more and more important. So as far as the semifinal exam structure, we'll take a peek at that now. All right, so the structure is different from previous years. This year, we're going to have 60 multiple choice questions, and Daniel Liu, all right, finalists, will be explaining those to you. There'll be 35 multiple true false. Yufei Chen will be doing that. And special thanks, he's not feeling well, but he's still coming through to help us. And the last section will be 4 short answer questions. Jonah Zhu and Grayson Wren will be giving that information, and I'll leave that all up to them. Okay, the next is our new location for finals is Harvard University. We're very excited about it. It will be from June 22nd through, I have July 2nd, 3rd, all right, to the 4th. They're still trying to decide how many days all of the finalists will be with us. Could be up through July 3rd for that. It will be a course, all right, a little bit different than our final structure, but you'll still get the rigor of preparing for the International Biology Olympiad at that time. And next, this is the schedule. You can always log on to the USABO homepage, usabo-trc.org, and into your own Student Resource Center for additional information, but the calendar is there. Semifinals will be, as you know, March 27, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, and they take 2 hours, a little bit past that when we start adding some of the other things that have to be uploaded. Again, look at your Student Resource Center. It explains exactly what you need to be doing for that exam. April 23 through May 3rd, we'll announce the finalists. There'll be 2 different registrations. Normally we have one called the USABO Finals Registration, and then Harvard wants you to register as well. Ours is a 12-page document, PDF that can be completed in a weekend. Harvard's is going to be a little more complex, those of you that go on to be finalists. It will require you to do such things as a letter of intent, letters of recommendation, scores, and other records. All right. And those will be published on the USABO site in the Student Resource Center, so you'll know exactly what they'll be requiring of you. It is a course and you will get credit, all right, for that course through Harvard. Finals are June 22nd through July 4, and the International Biology Olympiad is July 13 through the 20th. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to speak really well about this. Integrity of the USABO. Participants and the volunteers. The individuals that are here, Julianne and Daniel and Yufei and Grayson and soon to be Jonah, are all volunteers. They do this out of a passion for the program itself and helping us with all manner of things, all right? The purpose is we want it to be the most respected program that it can be. First of all, I'd like you to uphold the USABO Honor Code. On the Student Resource Center, you will find that copy of that. It's a longer document that you'll see on the exam itself. Please read it over and take it very seriously. In any and all areas, support is expected by the participants and the volunteers. Everyone is bound to that honor code and its implementation. Volunteers sign contracts, just like any other type of position. And those signed contracts are with the Center for Excellence in Education. And they're bound by the contract to perform certain elements and duties for the USABO and to respect the honors code itself and its implementation. So I'll say that over and over again, but I cannot stress how important that is. In addition, the volunteer contractors have background checks and other information that they fill, but one of the most important ones is the agreement. That goes out to anyone who volunteers to be a question developer. USABO alums who have graduated from high school, entered their first year of college, are invited to be question developers, right? Exam reviewers. The semifinal exam requires us to have 8 reviewers for the short answer questions. And that's done over a period of a week. But those people do an online review, much like an NS or National Science Foundation panel does a review of your scores. So everybody's questions are scored twice. If there's any deliberation, they go over that with them. So the panel is extremely important, but they are also bound by these restrictions. The other are the teaching assistants. Those are the people that will be with you during finals itself. They develop exam questions, presentations, all of that. Those are the property of the Center for Excellence Education. They are not to be sharing them with other people or keeping copies themselves. Those signed agreements are all with the Center for Education. So again, it's to make sure that we are doing the best we can to maintain the integrity. Okay, next slide. Okay, key elements of the contractor agreement. And this is the question writers, the TAs, all of them. They sign this agreement, all right? The assignment is the rights, the responsibilities, the duties under this agreement are on a personal to that contractor. Nobody else can have that. It's in their name and they sign it. The title is all test materials, work papers, documents, information, reports that are prepared by the contractor, and that can be the teaching assistant, question writer, the TA, scoring panel, in connection with the performance of the exams and the grading of those exams belong to CEE. The contractor also turns all that information over and it becomes our documentation here at the center. And it goes along with copyright and all manner of things. Trade secrets, non-disclosure, confidentiality. This commences as soon as they sign that agreement and start volunteering. And it's all on a volunteer basis. If they aren't able to volunteer that process, then they shouldn't be signing this contract, okay? And they agree to keep all the information confidential. whether or not prepared or developed by the contractor, because they're exposed to information that is not necessarily, developed by that particular contractor, question writer, or whatever. But that is to make sure that we maintain the integrity of the exam. And they should not disclose it to anyone else without prior consent from CEE. Nor can they use that information for their own purpose or to benefit someone other than CEE. And I'm going to point that out. I know many of you may be applying to programs to help you study for the semifinal exam or the open exam. Those are not part of the Center for Excellence in Education. All right, those are programs that are for profit of the people that are doing it. And they may be former IBO finalists or semifinalists. And if they are providing some of that instruction, that's a whole separate thing. They are not to share anything that they've done with the center, all right, with these particular organizations. And they can do any business as they want, but this has to be a separated entity, right? Making sure that those documents remain with the center and are not shared or exploited, all right, otherwise. And the next one, please. So respect and maintain that honor code. And this is it. If you are fortunate enough to go to the the International Biology Olympiad, all participants stand up and take the honor code and say, on my honor, I pledge myself to the integrity of the IBO. We do the USABO. I will not cheat on exams or problem sets. This means you're not going to be taking screenshots. You're not going to be using bots, any of those things. Okay, you are bound to maintain that integrity as much as possible. When you have your proctor watching you take that exam, whether it's virtually or in person, it is, without saying, so important that you keep your eyes on the screen and you do not move your screen anywhere, right? And you don't share that information on the exams with anybody, except for information regarding or problem sets, any of that. That's just not. And you don't tolerate anyone else doing it either, right? Because that's an instance of dishonesty, academic dishonesty, and it's a violation of the standards of the USABO. This year, we've had several reports, all right, of compromising the exam and scores. CE does follow those as much as we can. We rely on the anonymous presentation of those who come forward and say they have witnessed this. Don't like to do it? We want you to take the responsibility of making sure the exam is held in the highest regard, because we have schools looking at you for your results. They believe this is an exam of integrity, and the only ones that can maintain it are those of you taking those exams and the alums who are responsible for helping us present the information to you. The next slide, please. So in acknowledgement of the information provided by CEE, it goes on, and this is with all of you. In connection with this, my affirmation of the USABO Honor Code, I further acknowledge that I have been informed of the rights to collect, monitor, publicize statistical data, all right, by both the individual participants, groups, participants representing the same scholastic institution. No names or personal information is released by CEE unless in violation of the honor code. And that's only released to that student, to their school. Those are the only ones. And of course, we have to release them to the trustees of the Center for Excellence in Education. I also consent to public discourse of any information, statistical or otherwise, may indicate my involvement in a violation of that honor code, to which I have pledged my compliance. Such public discourse may include direct correspondence with colleges and universities at the sole discretion of the USABO. I encourage you, strongly recommend you read that honor code that is in the Student Resource Center. These are the parts of it. This is why it is so important. Next slide, please. So your goal is to be a semifinalist. All right. Here are the 20 from last year. We expect the highest, not only of your intelligence and your academia, but of your honor. That is key. There is no reason, all right, to cheat. And the next one, when we go to the IBO, the goal of your efforts as finalists is to make this team and to proudly represent the United States, that you have not done anything to dishonor the USABO, and you hold it in the highest of integrity. Because when you go there, you'll be facing 80 other nations, approximately 400 students from across the world, and they swear the same thing as you, honor not only the USABO, but the IBO. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Frame, for all of your wisdom. And next up, we will be introducing Yufei Chen. Yufei is a first-year computational biology major at MIT. He competed in USABO in all of his 3 years of high school and placed first at IBO in 2023. And Yufei will be going over study resources for the semifinal.
Yeah, hello. I will be going over the study resources for the semifinal exam. Next slide, please. So the first question is like how to study, and really I think it depends on the person. For some people, flashcards, notes, Anki flashcards might work, but not for others. For me, I find that reading textbooks and doing practice problems help the most. Especially with just 2 weeks left, intentional memorization does not seem very time efficient. Another thing is there is only 2 weeks left, so it's not possible to go over all of the resources. So I will be listing off a few textbooks. So it's not possible to use all of those resources in the time remaining before semifinals. So you should just focus on what you're not good at, because that's where you can get the most points back. So 2 weeks is probably just pick one textbook or one topic to fix, maybe two. Next slide. Okay, so for animal anatomy and physiology, the asterisk here is because really most of animal anatomy and physiology is human anatomy and physiology. So I recommend 3 of these. So Vander's is probably overall the best. If you haven't read this, this is probably the best yield. Fox is similar content, but it's presented a little differently. And then McKinley mostly focuses on anatomy, which is a contrast to the other two, but it doesn't show up too often, so it's a little less advised. For actual animal anatomy, like animal, like zoology, there are specialized textbooks for those, but to be honest, not much that's beyond Campbell ever shows up. So once again, refer back to Campbell. Next slide. For plant, Raven is pretty much the only option. Uh, there's a lot of books out there, but they're pretty out of scope. And even some of Raven's chapters are out of scope. So if you've never seen it on a test, you should skip it. But Raven's is an option. For biochemistry, Leninger is probably the best textbook. It requires quite a bit of organic chemistry to fully understand, but even without the organic chemistry background, it's still very helpful for studying various biochemical pathways and grasping the intuition of how the biochemistry works. Next slide. Molecular biology, Mbach, Alberts. This is this is my favorite textbook of all time. It's a very dense textbook, and it is quite difficult, but it also has a lot of very helpful practice questions embedded in the book itself that really helped with my studying for molecular biology. Next slide. Genetics, there's like two that I know of that I've completely read, Brooker's and Griffith's. Personally, I like Griffith's because it has like really good practice problems. I think that practice problems are the best way to study before the test because they really force you to assess like how well you learned this knowledge and it allows you to focus on your weak areas to improve on. Next slide. There are a lot of other topics such as biosystematics, ecology, ethology. These are smaller topics by percent on the test. And as a result, I wouldn't encourage studying specialized textbooks for them at this stage. Uh, most of them, most of these other topics is covered at a sufficient depth, even in Campbell's biology for the semifinal exam. But if you really want, here are some other resources. There's two ecology textbooks here, Elements of Ecology and Introduction to Behavioral Ecology. Both of these are good textbooks for ecology. And I think behavioral ecology is a lot more applicable because it explains animal behavior, which is the thing that shows up more. Another thing you can use as a resource is all of the BRS textbooks. Those are for med school. Uh, those are those are difficult, but they're also very high yield because they focus on the most relevant aspects. So, for example, the immunology BRS textbook is incredibly helpful. Next slide. Another thing is practice tests are very helpful. So I would encourage doing past semifinal exams under the time constraints given during those exams. So you can have a feeling of your timing because timing is very important, though as a bit of a heads up, this year's timing will feel a lot different from previous years because of the changes to the sections. Past IBO exams are very good for Part B because they have the grading scheme that I'll explain later. And if you really have time, there are other countries' tests. India's national tests are probably the closest to semifinals difficulty, and they are also under the IBO format usually. So those are very helpful. And then there's a few other English-speaking countries that have public tests, but those are usually quite a bit easier than semifinals, so maybe not as recommended. And there are some untranslated tests, and personally, I don't think it's worth at about 2 weeks left to be doing those. Yeah, and that's the end of my section here. Julian, you're muted.
Sorry. Okay, thank you so much, Yuhei, for talking about all of the study resources and kind of practice test strategies. Now Daniel will be going over some study tips, which are especially important in the last final weeks before the exam. So Daniel is a freshman at UC Berkeley, majoring in molecular and cellular biology. He is interested mainly in the intersection of immunology and flies, doing lab work to investigate the effect of activator location on Drosophila transcription. Apart from his studies, he enjoys playing piano or a quick round of bullet chess.
All right, thank you. So we're going to talk a little bit about just some study tips. This is going to kind of iterate on what Yufei said, but first of all, when you're studying, since there are like only a couple of weeks left, I would recommend you guys like make a plan for when you study and whatever like you have like content to study. So make a plan for like what day you're going to study what chapter or something like that. Um, I would recommend you guys to be like realistic. Don't say like you're gonna study like 10 hours a day or something because you probably won't do that because you have other commitments. So make sure to stay balanced even with like USABO coming up. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about taking notes. Some people have asked me this question, which is, what's the best way to take notes? Honestly, you've mentioned this earlier, but it's kind of dependent per person. So some people really like taking notes. Some people think it's like a kind of a waste of time. For me, if I'm pretty close to the semifinal exam, then I would try to take down some of the stuff that I might like forget later, or just like stuff that's like pretty important, so like diagrams, stuff like that. And then the next thing that you should be doing, since we're pretty close to the semifinal exam, is reviewing. So you should set up some sort of schedule to review your important information. So like diagrams. For vocabulary, if you want, you can have flashcards, so like Anki, but this is more of like an up to you thing. It's like a personal preference. I sometimes use flashcards, but otherwise I just like refer back to like the textbooks. And then finally we have mock exams. You should do like the semifinal mock exams and make sure that you're under time pressure because it's really different to know like how you're doing your time management when you're under like some sort of like time crunch for like semifinals, for instance. And yeah, so that's some study tips. Next slide, please. So now we're gonna talk about what you should do like during just like the days before semis. So obviously you should start reviewing. This is I covered in the last slide, but try not to like learn new information within like these final days because it's not gonna stick. And then just review like important diagrams and tables. So for instance, your amino acids are important, hormones, vitamins, etc., etc. And then finally, we get to the day before the test. So this is really important. So make sure you guys sleep early the day before the exam and preferably even better the day before that as well. So make sure you allocate your time properly. You're probably going to notice this whenever you take your mock exams, but for instance, if a question is taking you a long time, you should probably guess an answer first and then skip it and then make a note of it. And you should also pay attention to which kind of problems you take the longest in, because then you can kind of almost predict what kind of question will take you a long time, and maybe you can skip that preemptively. And last but not least, there's not really there's no penalty for like answering a question, so you should answer all the question, even if that means like you should guess in the last few minutes. So yeah, now we're going to talk about just part A. I'm going to walk you through it, some of the format and a sample question. So the part A format hasn't changed. It's still going to be a 60 multiple choice question. Pretty much every single question will have one correct answer. And so the question format will kind of be similar to what you saw in USABO Opens because each question on that exam also had one correct answer. So we're gonna do like an example question. This is sort of like an average question that you might get on part A. So you would read through your 5 choices, A, B, C, D, E, and you would pick the one that sounds the right to you. So 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 I'm gonna take you guys through this question and how I would solve it. So I would read the question first of all, because that's reading is really important. This is something that I sometimes even myself fail to do. But which of the following experimental results would specifically show that MyoD expression is sufficient for skeletal muscle differentiation? So unlike in like past times where the exam was on paper, you can't really underline things anymore on like on the question itself, but you can obviously use your mouse to like highlight keywords or something like that if that's helpful to you. So for instance, in this question, I would think about MyoD expression, and if we don't know, even if we didn't know what that was, we could probably read some of the answer choices to figure out what kind of thing that was. It seems like it's some sort of protein or something like that, or some sort of gene since it has expression right after it. And then one other key word to note here is like sufficient, which means that only MyoD is required for skeletal muscle differentiation, as it says. So I'm going to read through the choices and then we'll go through the answer rationale on the next slide. So first of all, A is standing for MyoD protein reveals it to be only expressed in skeletal muscle tissue. B is deleting the MyoD gene in mice results in normal skeletal muscles, while deleting both the MyoD and MyF5 genes results in immobile mice that don't survive birth. And C is the Belgian blue breed of cattle, which develops hyperplasia, which is increased number of skeletal muscle fibers, was shown to carry a loss of function mutation in myostatin, a gene repressed by MyoD. And D is mutations which disrupt the MyoD DNA binding sites upstream of the MyoD gene, result in incomplete skeletal muscle differentiation. And E is introducing a plasmid expressing myodi into fat cells or fibroblasts causes them to express skeletal muscle genes such as myosin fuse into signatia and contract upon calcium ion injection. So, so if you want to, you can take a screenshot of this and work on this on your own, because I will explain my answer rationale on the next slide. So, as I said before, the key word here is sufficient, which means that only MyoD expression is required for differentiate without other genes. So how I would do it, I would just read through the answer choices first. So A seems already suspicious because there's the word only, and usually that isn't usually something associated with with sufficient things. And the condition would still happen if other genes were required for differentiation. So the first phrase, deleting myod results in normal expression, is pretty much a red flag because sufficient means that you need it for normal expression. So if you delete it, um, then it shouldn't have normal expression anymore. So this is probably the first one that I would eliminate. C is saying that is kind of tricky because just because an individual has greater than normal muscle after like repressing a gene doesn't mean that this gene like totally inhibits muscle differentiation. You have to like kind of read between the lines here. But I would save C as sort of a candidate answer. D is if there is incomplete differentiation without MyoD expression, it probably means that so some other gene is also required for MyoD for differentiation. So I would probably eliminate D because of that. E actually sounds the most promising because it seems to suggest that MyoD is required since other non-stem cells, such as like fibroblasts, differentiate in the presence of only the MyoD plasmid. So comparing C and E, I would think that E is the better choice. So my final answer would probably be E. And note that even if you didn't know what MyoD is at first, you could probably infer just from reading the problem that it's some sort of like gene that helps to differentiate differentiate cells into muscle tissue. And I think that's it for my section.
Thank you, Daniel, for going over study strategies and part A. Next, Yufei will be back to talk a little bit more about part B.
Yeah, okay. Next slide. Okay, so part B this year is a little different from previous years. So in previous years, part B were questions that were like either like select one choice or you get points for selecting all the choices correct. But now part B follows IBO rules, so it's a multiple true-false question with 4 choices and you select all that are true. Each question is worth twice as much as a question from part A. And unlike before, there is partial credit for getting some of the choices correct. If you get all of it correct, then you get full credit. And if you get 3 correct, you get 1.2 points. If you get 2 correct, 0.4. Otherwise, you get no points. So this makes Part B a much more valuable section than before. I think in previous years, a lot of people, myself included, skipped Part B in favor of going to Part C and then coming back to Part B. But I think this year, in terms of test taking strategies, it might be valuable to go through Part B as well, because there is actually an incentive in terms of points to do so because it's no longer all or nothing. Next slide. So we're going to go over 2 sample questions. So this is the first sample question. So I'll read it out for each of the following statements, blah, 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 indicate whether the statement is true or false. A, proteins destined for the nucleus contain a negatively charged nuclear localization signal recognized by important proteins, facilitating their transport through the nuclear pore complex. Mitochondrial proteins generally have an N-terminal mitochondrial targeting sequence that directs into the mitochondrial matrix where the signal is cleaved upon entry. Secreted proteins generally lack an N-terminal signal peptide because they are synthesized on free ribosomes in the cytosol. And the last choice is endoplasmic reticulum resident proteins commonly have a C-terminal K-del sequence that serve as an ER retrieval signal in showing their retention in or return to the ER after passage through the Golgi. So here there is a combination of things that you need to have memorized from common textbooks. So this is inspired a lot by MBach. and a combination of things you can infer logically. So for choice A, it should be well known that the nuclear localization sequence is positively charged. The way I memorize this is the nucleus contains negatively charged DNA, and a negatively charged DNA, so the sequence would be positively charged is one way I think about it. So A is false. B, mitochondrial proteins do indeed have a targeting sequence. You can read more about this and the two transport complexes, Tim and Tom, that move these into the mitochondria. So this is true. C is something you can reason because secreted proteins must be synthesized on bound ribosomes. So C is pretty clearly false here. And then D is another question you probably need to just memorize. And this is pretty common knowledge from MBOK that the KDEL sequence moves proteins back from the Golgi. Okay, next slide. So here is another sample question in a different category. This is more about ecology. So A, in many aquatic systems, phosphorus is typically limiting. In terrestrial, nitrogen is more frequently limiting. So A is true here. This is something you could either know because when you hear about eutrophication, usually it's about the phosphate being an issue, for example. So you can infer this from other knowledge. And the use of more weak terms, like more frequently, as opposed to always, is something that suggests that this is true. B, the tridivores and decomposers are minor contributors to nutrient cycling in ecosystems compared to the role of primary producers. So this is also false because decomposers are very important in recycling all of the nutrients. All of the nutrients eventually go through the decomposer in every cycle of any nutrient because they return it to the soil or whatever other substrate, the water, maybe in ocean ecosystems. So this is also false. C is a tricky one. So the inefficiency of, so this sounds like a reference to the 10% rule, but C is a reminder to read a little more carefully because the question is saying that there is a 10% loss when in reality it's a 10% retention. So C is actually false just because of the number. And in D, this is directly against the idea of ecological succession because these cycling processes change significantly as the ecosystem becomes more mature. Next slide. Okay, so the timing is not true. You don't have about 2 minutes per question. It's closer to like 1 minute per question. This was made under the assumption that we would have fewer questions, but it turns out there is 35. So, and also 60 part one. So this actually turns out to be closer to like 1 minute and 20-ish seconds per question for part B, if you want to spend like a constant amount of time per points. So once again, there is still some points, even if you don't get the entire question correct. So don't just skip part B. But another thing is you still don't want to spend too much time. If you notice a question is really long, if there's like a massive paragraph, I would still skip or guess and come back later when you have time. And this applies not only for part B, but for the other sections as well. Next slide.
Okay. Thank you so much to Yufei for kind of explaining a little bit more about how to approach this new part B section. And now Jonah and Grayson will be discussing part C. So Jonah is a sophomore at MIT studying bioengineering. He was a 2022 and 2023 finalist and was a TA in 2024. Off campus, you can find him enjoying ramen with friends, biking, or attempting to study at Boston Public Library. And Grayson is a current junior at MIT studying computer science and molecular biology. He's broadly interested in the development and application of computational tools in biological research. He was a USABO finalist in 2021 and 2022 and has been involved in the exam writing process in 2023 and 2024.
Thanks, Julianne. So I think before we get started on this section, it would be helpful just to reiterate the point breakdown because there's been a good number of questions on the Q&A asking about exactly how this works. So there's going to be 3 parts on the exam this year. Part A is 60 questions of multiple choice worth 1 point each. Part B is 35 multiple true false questions worth 2 points each. And part C will be 4 short answer questions worth 15 points each. So the breakdown is 60, 70, 60, and only 3 parts on the exam. Kathy, please correct me if that was wrong. Okay.
You're right.
So great, thank you. Yeah, so as for the structure of the exam, like I mentioned earlier, part C is going to be these 4 15-point each short response questions, and they're going to be primarily focused on these 4 subject areas, which roughly or directly correspond to the IBO practical topics this year. So the 4 topics will be biomedical sciences, cell and molecular biology, ecology and systematics, and microbiology. Of course, these topics are not explicitly their own subjects within the USABO, but the format of these exams will generally be applicable to knowledge that you've learned to solve other questions in the USABO in parts A and B. And so it's not necessary to specially study topics that you wouldn't have otherwise, but it's going to be a focus rather than being only about these topics. And then within part C, there's going to be partial credit given on select questions. This is sometimes noted down that partial credit will be given, but you can generally assume that grading will be fairly flexible on some of this. And the content here, instead of the earlier questions that are more recall oriented, are going to focus a lot more on reasoning and experimental skills. And so you'll see questions that will ask you to do calculations, draw some graphs, draw schematics or diagrams, or provide longer form short answer responses to questions with your reasoning. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so like Yufei mentioned before, with the new structure of semis, there is a heavier emphasis on part B, since it focuses more on accuracy rather than speed. However, because this is the first year this change has been implemented, I would highly recommend surveying the test first to see which section is closest to what you know. If part C, for instance, have a lot of questions that you can easily answer, I would start with that section first. And within part C, because there's 4 sections broken down by topic, also survey all the questions and start in the sections you know best first. The questions within the section, although they're typically sequenced, for instance, they might give you a experimental scenario or data to analyze. Not all the questions are ordered by difficulty. It still might be possible to skip a question you don't know and still get points later in the section. Sometimes, because we give partial credit, writing a best guess that's scientifically based is better than writing nothing. On that note, be very concise and accurate. When grading, if we see that you're just listing a lot of buzzwords or trying to write catch-all statements, those will not receive any points. So it's better to just move on if you don't think you can give a best guess on a question. All right, so we mentioned a few question types before, so we'll just go over 3 sample questions. So Grayson, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, so I'll go over this one pretty quickly. So you can see that this is a set of questions from past exam. So choice A here is really testing you on understanding that like Chargaff's rules for base matching between A and T and U is not necessarily valid when you're looking at single-stranded RNA. And so you'll be asked to provide a simple yes/no answer, but a majority of the points you can see are coming from your explanation afterward of what's happening. There is also questions such as the next one that focus more on broader reasoning. Sorry, that's like in part C, but in choice C. So B is very similar to A, where you're asked a straightforward question of, is this more or less stable? And then you'll get some amount of points for stating the answer being correct or false, and then a greater amount of points for being able to reason or explain why the choice you selected is correct. We are looking for matching logic generally. So sometimes it may be the case that the logic you've written down is not consistent with the answer you've given, which depending on the exact question may be graded as being completely incorrect. And then on the right here, we can see later on, it's more about interpretation. So you're given an experiment of what's happening and a plot of what's happening, and you're being asked to evaluate exactly what the results of this are saying. And so that's the style of question as well. But notice again, there's a lot of emphasis on explaining reasoning. And general goal of part C is to make sure that you have the understanding of what's happening and you're able to explain that rather than just be selecting an answer choice and going. All right, next slide, please.
Yeah, so this is an example of a question that might appear on the biomedical section of the short answer section. So they'll give you a scenario. In this case, it's important to note that for questions that require some sort of equation or background knowledge, this will typically be given to you in the scenario before the questions. And then the questions will be focused on analyzing those unfamiliar equations or scenarios based on what you already know. So the first part is just a calculation question. You should write out the equations that you use. So you can use abbreviations or some sort of arrangement of numbers that implies you're using an equation. And then that gives you credence to get partial credit if you maybe do a math error. The second section is asking you to analyze the equation. In this case, expect maybe one part to give you points for identifying the effect on CVO2, and then the majority of points comes from your brief explanation. And then third section is very similar to the second section where you're asked again to give an explanation for a physiological scenario. So relatively straightforward, but this is an example of where a calculation could come in handy. All right, and this question is sample question 3. Is an example of a question where you might be asked to draw something. So in this case, you're asked to draw 2 survivorship curves based on descriptions. And although these are only worth 2 points, you should expect to receive some sort of partial credit based on maybe where the graph intersects the axes and also the general shape of the graph. So when you're asked to draw something, be very deliberate on how you draw either your graph or some annotation.
Okay, so just a little bit more about how exactly this is going to be graded on the grader end of this. So for uploading, I think there was a question about this as well. So you're expected to write your responses on paper and scan them, and you'll have additional time after the 2 hours of the exam time to upload your Part C responses to AOPS. So a helpful tip is it's good to pre-label your blank paper with your USABO ID. That way you don't have to go through and make extras if you run out during the test, and it just is something you can get done beforehand. And it's good to have extra blank paper. Just make sure you have enough to write out all your responses. It's also helpful to practice scanning and uploading your responses before test day. So make sure that you're familiar with whatever scanning software you're planning on using and familiar with however you plan on getting that to your computer. Whether you can scan it directly onto your computer or you have to scan with your phone and upload it. Just make sure you're familiar with exactly how that process works so you can streamline it during the test day. And then on the test day, when you do the upload, you'll have a portal where you can submit the scanned PDF for each question, just try to make sure you're uploading the right solution to each question, because it would be really a shame if the work that you've put into doing the short response question for part C wasn't uploaded to the correct place. And so just make sure you're double checking that. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so just a bit of what happens behind the scenes with grading. So when graders access responses, they are anonymized by your USABO ID number, and each response is graded by 2 people on AOPS. And this is based on a rubric that is on the answer key. Some general guidelines for this is to not put your name or other identifying information other than your USABO ID number on your answer sheet or even in your file name. So be very careful when you're using a scanning app or some other software to upload your responses. Make sure it doesn't automatically add your name to the file name, because we cannot grade responses if the person's real name is on there. Also, within your responses, clearly label which question subpart you're answering. So if a question has parts A, B, C, D, and you only answer part C, please write that you're answering part C next to your response. Otherwise, it is hard to infer what section you're trying to answer. Also, lastly, please write legibly. Graders will do their best to parse through responses that are a little messy, but if it's unreadable, it cannot be graded.
Okay, thank you so much to Grayson and Jonah for their explanation on part C. And now we'll be opening the floor to questions. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the Q&A box. I think it would be helpful to talk about any reminders for the AOPS registration, and kind of the format for the exam, if Mrs. Frame would like to.
AOP registration, you mean for the semifinal, yeah?
Yeah, kind of just any reminders for how it's going to be set up online.
So what happens is you've already registered with the Art of Problem Solving, and what they'll ask me to do is to send the ID numbers for the, I think this is what you're asking, the students who are taking the semifinal exam. Right, and then it's very much like what you did with the open exam, all right? You will go in, you will log in to your AOPS account, all right? And then you should see a link that says take the semifinal exam, or you'll get a link, all right, there to do that.
I think Grayson was going to answer some questions related to part C.
Yeah, so there's a question here about using blank versus lined paper for part C. I think it's really up to you. Just know that sometimes you'll be asked to draw things that don't necessarily fit within the lines. And so if that's something you can work around, lined paper is great because it helps you keep each of your answers organized for each subpart. And it can be helpful for some of the graphing problems, but sometimes you'll be drawing circular diagrams that don't necessarily fit within the lines. So in that sense, blank paper is more generally useful because you can draw on it however you want. There's also a question about adding number scales to graphs. I think it depends on the question. So if a question is asking you to graph something and it's giving you numbers in the question, or you're expected to compute certain numbers, you should include them on your graph because labels are really important. But if the question is asking you to graph a trend, you can just label your axes of what they're measuring, and then you can just show the trend of what's happening because you don't have numbers. So it's good to use numbers where you have them. And then there's one more about abbreviations. If you think that the grader knows your abbreviation beforehand, then feel free to use it. But if you're not willing to run that risk, the graders are not going to be spending time looking up abbreviations to double check what you're saying. So if it's a common enough abbreviation, for example, you don't have to write out green fluorescent protein. I think all of the graders will know what GFP is. But if you're using a more esoteric abbreviation, you could label it at the start of your answer. Just say this abbreviation means this, or run the risk of someone not knowing what you're talking about.
Thank you, Grayson, for all of your expertise on part C grading. I think Jonah also will be answering a couple of questions on semifinals.
Sure. So there's one about the class of calculator and also the practice materials. So USABO wants to follow the IBO guidelines when it comes to releasing past exams. So the exams available to you in the Teacher Resource Center are the past exams that are available to practice with. I believe it's up to 2021 or 2022. And then for class calculator, 4 function calculators are allowed. Graphing calculators or programmable calculators are not allowed. There's also a quick question about just reiterating the scanning pages. So you will write your short answer responses on paper, and you will scan after the 2-hour time limit is up and upload to AOPS. And in terms of proctoring, your students will upload to their own devices. You won't have to do any scanning on your end.
Okay, thank you, Jonah. I guess one question that we had was, I guess how people go about studying biosystematics, since I guess that was not mentioned in the previous.
I can try to tackle this a bit. I just want to preface, I was not a part of the exam review process this year, so I don't know anything about how this particular short answer is written. But just in terms of general principles of Part C, Part C is a lot more concept-based rather than recall-based. And so a lot of what you typically think of as biosystematics in terms of what group or what clade does this thing belong to, like what characteristics are involved here. A lot of the similar information might be included, but it's going to be a lot more in a problem-solving capacity than in a recall capacity. The other thing to note is that the short answer section is called systematics and ecology, and so like a hefty portion of this will be ecology based as well. That being said, in terms of studying for systematics, I think generally Campbell's systematics chapters are considered sufficient in terms of scope and depth for what you'll need for the USABO. So that would be my main recommendation if you're really interested in learning more about systematics to prepare for that.
Thanks, Grayson. I think those were all the questions that we'll be able to take today. Thank you so much for joining us. And we hope that this webinar was helpful. The recording of this webinar will be posted onto the CEE YouTube and to the USABO website in the next week. So keep an eye out for that if you want to review any of this content. And best of luck on kind of the final stretch before semifinals in your studying, and that you will all do great. Thank you so much again.